Atheists don't just reject God, they often hate the very idea of him, believing he's nothing more than a human invention. But what if that hatred isn't really about God at all? We think rejecting God makes us free, but Carl Jung thought it might actually mean we've become possessed, not by religion, but by our own unconscious. Maybe it's not about belief or disbelief, but something buried deep in the human psyche, something Jung believed we're all trying to avoid. I once asked an atheist friend why the idea of God bothered him so much. He said, "Because it feels like someone's watching, even when I know no one is." When someone says, "I don't believe in God," it sounds calm, rational, like a simple philosophical conclusion. But Jung noticed something else. Disbelief often carries an unexpected heat, a sharp intensity, a quiet anger beneath the words. It isn't cold detachment, it's irritation, restlessness, sometimes even disgust. So Jung asked, how can an idea you claim means nothing stir so much emotion inside you? In Jungian psychology, strong emotion is never accidental. It is the signal of an archetype awakening. And the God image, as Jung described it, is one of the most powerful archetypes in the entire human psyche, a symbol of totality, of ultimate order, of meaning itself. When we reject it consciously, the unconscious doesn't simply stand down. It resists. It pushes back. The spiritual energy that once moved toward God doesn't vanish. It searches for a new vessel. So instead of kneeling before God, we kneel before other things: ideology, reason, science, the state, success, or even our own self-image. Jung wrote, "You can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return." The modern atheist may never fold his hands in prayer, but he still believes. He believes in progress. He believes in rationality. He believes in the perfectibility of man. These beliefs are not wrong. They are simply inevitable, because the psyche needs orientation. It needs a myth to live by. And the danger begins the moment we convince ourselves that we live without one. When Jung said the atheist may become possessed by the unconscious, he meant that the archetypal energy, once projected onto God, returns to the individual ego. Suddenly, we carry the burden of omnipotence. We become our own gods, creators of meaning, judges of morality, architects of truth. That sounds liberating until it becomes crushing. Because if everything depends on you, then failure, chaos, and suffering have nowhere else to go. There is no higher order to hold them. Meaning becomes self-manufactured, fragile, easily shattered by tragedy. This is the paradox Jung saw in modern man. We have dethroned God in the heavens, only to enthrone the ego in the same seat. And the ego was never built to carry that weight. When the ego inflates with divine attributes, it becomes a kind of psychological idolatry. And sooner or later, the shadow of that inflation arrives. Cynicism, nihilism, despair. That is why Jung warned that the rejection of God is not a simple intellectual act. It is a psychic event with consequences. The psyche will rebalance itself one way or another, through obsession, through ideology, through neurosis. Anything to restore the lost connection to something larger than the self. Jung never condemned atheism. He respected disbelief that was honest. Disbelief born from the struggle to find authentic meaning, rather than blind obedience. What he criticized was the denial of the religious function, the idea that humans can live without any relationship to the numinous. Even the most rational skeptic, Jung said, still dreams, still feels awe before nature, still searches for purpose. Those experiences are the psyche speaking in mythological language. To deny them is to cut off the roots of one's own soul. So when an atheist says, "I hate the idea of God," Jung might reply, "You hate what God has come to represent for you. Dogma, authority, hypocrisy. But the deeper image of God, the archetype itself, still lives in you. And perhaps the hatred is really a protest against the distorted symbol, not against the symbol's true psychological meaning." When you repress something powerful, it doesn't disappear. It slips into shadow. Jung believed that every time humanity tries to destroy the image of God, the same energy re-emerges in disguised form. It becomes politics, nationalism, moral crusades, or even the worship of technology. He saw it clearly in the 20th century. The fall of traditional religion didn't create a vacuum of belief. It created new gods, collective movements demanding the same devotion churches once required. People no longer confessed in cathedrals. They confessed on battlefields, in party meetings, in ideological revolutions. The external symbol changed, but the psychological function remained. Humanity still craved the sacred. We just transferred it from heaven to earth. Jung called this process projection, when the contents of the unconscious are cast onto the world outside us. The divine archetype is too vast for the ego to integrate all at once, so we project it. When belief collapses, we stop projecting it onto God and start projecting it onto something human. That's why modern movements feel almost religious. The leader becomes a messiah. The ideology becomes scripture. Dissent becomes heresy. We think we've escaped faith, but in reality, we've only changed its object. The atheist who despises religion may still be devoutly religious in his devotion to reason, or justice, or freedom. He has simply replaced one myth with another, unaware that both spring from the same psychological root. For Jung, the danger wasn't atheism itself, but unconscious belief. When faith hides from itself, it becomes fanatical. It no longer questions, no longer relates to the mystery. It tries to possess it. Jung never dismissed science or reason. He saw them as essential expressions of consciousness. But when reason becomes the only God, it casts a long shadow, the denial of mystery, the contempt for intuition, the fear of meaning beyond measurement. This shadow appears in a modern mind's obsession with control. If the world has no inherent order, then we must impose one, through logic, through data, through constant mastery. But beneath that control lies anxiety, the terror that without some higher pattern, everything collapses into chaos. The irony is that this anxiety is a spiritual experience, the same awe and dread that ancient people once felt before God. We've just renamed it existential crisis. Faith, to Jung, was not belief in doctrine. It was a relationship with the unknown, a living dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between the ego and the self, between man and the numinous. When that dialogue breaks down, the psyche compensates. Atheists often see faith as submission. Jung saw it as integration. The ego recognizing forces larger than itself and entering into relationship with them. To him, refusing that relationship does not make you rational. It leaves you alone with forces you no longer understand. That is why Jung said, modern man does not need more faith or less faith. He needs a new understanding of faith. Not obedience to dogma, but acknowledgement of mystery. Jung's patients did not suffer from sin or guilt in the traditional sense. They suffered from meaninglessness. They had achieved comfort, knowledge, even freedom, yet felt hollow. Among all my patients in the second half of life, Jung wrote, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. By religious, he did not mean church attendance. He meant connection. Connection to something transcendent, to purpose, to the unfolding of one's own inner story. Without that connection, the psyche fragments. Depression, addiction, compulsive work. These are symptoms of a soul cut off from its myth. So when atheists say they hate the idea of God, perhaps what they really hate is the emptiness that comes from living without a symbol, powerful enough to hold their longing for meaning. It is not hatred of God. It is hatred of the void that follows when God disappears. The unconscious, Jung warned, will not tolerate neglect. If we refuse to face the divine within, it re-enters our lives through obsession or despair. The person who rejects all myths may find himself enslaved to one he does not recognize. The myth of progress. The myth of control, the myth of self-sufficiency. That is what Jung meant by being possessed by the unconscious. It is when the ego, believing itself godless, becomes godlike, inflated, isolated, and secretly terrified. So what is the alternative? Jung's answer was not conversion, it was integration. We reclaim the image of God from projection and bring it back into the psyche where it belongs. That means facing the mystery instead of running from it. Allowing the God within, what Jung called the self, to balance the ego. To seek wholeness, not certainty. The atheist who can do this is not betraying reason, he is expanding it. He is acknowledging that the human mind contains depths that reason alone cannot map. And in that acknowledgement, the idea of God becomes psychological truth, a symbol of the total self, a pattern that unites conscious and unconscious life. Jung once said, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life." You can strip away dogma, ritual, even belief itself, but you cannot erase the human hunger for significance. That hunger, Jung believed, is the voice of the self, calling the ego to awaken. For Jung, religion was not doctrine, it was a psychological function, a natural way the psyche maintains balance. When that function is repressed, the psyche compensates. It compensates through dreams, through symbols, through emotional crises. People begin to experience inner events they cannot explain, anxiety that feels cosmic, nightmares of judgment, overwhelming awe before beauty or death. These are not signs of madness. They are the psyche speaking its forgotten language. To seek God, in Jung's sense, means learning to interpret that language again, recognizing that the numinous still lives within experience. Modern atheists often believe they have outgrown myth. But Jung argued that myth is not primitive fiction. It is the coded map of the psyche. When you read ancient stories of gods and heroes, you are reading blueprints of the inner world, the struggle between ego and shadow, order and chaos, birth and rebirth. We may no longer kneel before Zeus or Yahweh, but the archetypes remain active. The question is not whether you serve a god. The question is, which one? When we forget that myths are internal, we live them unconsciously. We chase money as if it were salvation, fame as if it were immortality, love as if it could redeem the world. To seek God today might mean reclaiming myth consciously, recognizing the symbolic dimension of our own drives, living them with awareness instead of worshipping them blindly. The first step toward awareness is to face the shadow. Every time we denounce belief as childish or evil, we project onto believers the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. Our own need for belonging, our own fear of insignificance. The atheist who mocks faith may secretly envy its passion. The believer who condemns doubt may secretly fear his own disbelief. Jung said, "The person who looks outside dreams. The one who looks inside awakens." Looking inside means acknowledging that the line between faith and disbelief runs through every soul. Each of us contains both, the longing for certainty and the impulse to question it. Integration begins when we stop fighting that tension and let it teach us humility. Jung called the path of integration individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. In traditional religion, God represents perfection. In psychology, individuation is the movement toward that same wholeness. It is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming complete, conscious of light and shadow, reason and mystery, mortal limits and eternal patterns. For Jung, this process is the modern form of faith. It demands courage, it demands patience, it demands honesty. Qualities once cultivated through prayer and ritual. To individuate is to live as if meaning matters, even when you cannot prove it. It is a quiet devotion to truth, not as doctrine, but as lived experience. So how can a modern atheist seek God without betraying reason? By recognizing the sacred in psychological terms, through self-knowledge, by exploring dreams, fantasies, art and emotion as messages from the deeper psyche, through awe, by standing before nature or music or human connection and allowing yourself to feel wonder without needing to call it supernatural, through values, by living according to what gives life coherence, truth, beauty, love, not as proofs of God, but as manifestations of what Jung called the numinosum, the energy of the self. Through humility, by admitting that the rational mind, powerful as it is, rides on an ocean it cannot control. Faith, in this sense, is not belief in propositions. It is trust in experience, the willingness to relate to what transcends comprehension. It is the courage to say, something larger is moving through me, and I choose to listen. Earlier, we said that rejecting God can feel like liberation, but Jung would add, true freedom is not the absence of all masters. It is conscious relationship with what rules you. When the ego refuses any higher order, it becomes enslaved to hidden compulsions. When it acknowledges the self, the inner God image, it gains partnership instead of domination. Freedom without meaning becomes chaos. Meaning without freedom becomes tyranny. Faith, psychologically understood, is the balance point between the two. Today we face what philosophers call the meaning crisis. Religion has collapsed for many. Science explains much, but cannot tell us why to live. The result is what Jung predicted decades ago: widespread neurosis, loneliness, polarization, addiction to ideology and consumption. He foresaw that humanity would rediscover spirituality not by returning to the past, but by descending into the psyche, finding the divine within rather than above. That descent is terrifying. It means confronting emptiness, confronting guilt, confronting mortality. But beneath those depths lies the living symbol of the self, waiting to be recognized. Jung psychology does not ask atheists to convert or believers to renounce faith. It asks both to enter dialogue with the unknown. To the atheist it says, your disbelief is part of a larger search. Do not let it harden into cynicism. To the believer it says, your faith is symbolic. Do not mistake the symbol for the mystery itself. The goal is wholeness, not victory. When we stop trying to prove or disprove God, the conversation can finally begin. If the word God is too heavy, Jung would say, change the word, not the experience. Call it the self. Call it the total psyche. Call it the principle of meaning. The name does not matter. The relationship does. Because what we call God is the image of our own potential wholeness. To hate that image is to hate a part of ourselves. To seek it is to come home. Maybe the question is not whether God exists. Maybe the question is whether you can afford to live as if nothing sacred does. The atheist who dares to explore that question is already on the path. He is doing what Jung called the work of the soul, turning inward, facing the mystery, making peace with the archetype that refuses to die. In the end, why atheists hate the idea of God is not about atheism or belief. It is about the universal human struggle to reconcile freedom with meaning, reason with wonder, ego with the infinite. We all wrestle with the divine image, some by worshipping it, others by rejecting it. But the wrestling itself, Jung believed, is sacred. It is how consciousness evolves. It is how the soul remembers what it is made of. So maybe the task is not to believe or disbelieve, but to listen to that quiet presence inside that keeps asking questions no science and no scripture can silence. Call it God, call it psyche, call it life itself. Whatever name you give it, the search remains the same. And as long as humans exist, the idea of God hated, loved, denied, or rediscovered will never disappear, because it was never just an idea. It was us.